All right, let's get started. Welcome back. I hope you're enjoying your morning so far. Happy Friday. We're coming really close to the end of the quarter. So this is the end of week 7. And after this week, we only have 2 full weeks left. As a reminder, we don't have any formal meeting in class or like through Zoom for the final exam window. So I know a lot of people are gone, traveling, or whatever, during finals. And honestly, the turnaround between the end of the winter quarter and the beginning of spring is super, super short. So that period of time, as we get to the end of the quarter, is just an opportunity for you to catch up on remaining assignments and things that you need to do. I'll be posting some information on Canvas to help you out in terms of timeline and remaining things that you'll need to do for this class as you're preparing to wrap things up. But just to put things at a glance, remember that your second essay is due by March 6th. Again, that's coming up a week from this Sunday, and that you can use those prompts that are available on Canvas. We're working on that. I will also be pushing back the week 6 quiz to that date too, since I'm posting that later and just want to give you some more time to work on that. The final assignment of the course that we'll talk a little bit about more next week, but I'll give you a preview of on Canvas, will be the listening debrief. And it's a bookend to what we all did in the very beginning of the quarter, where it asked you to use active listening for conversation with somebody else. So you'll do that again and apply some of the things we talked about for the end of the quarter. And then one just kind of last reminder and hard deadline for you to just have on your radar, right, is that if you're planning to turn in assignments later, all of the remaining assignments for the class do need to be in by March 19th. The reason for that, right, is that I have to submit grades to EOU, right? So I can't like change or update your grade past that. So that's sort of the hard cutoff that EOU gives for classes this term. Just have that on your radar that you'll need to complete things by that date if you still have like makeup assignments or other things that are late that you'll need to work on. So last class, we talked a little bit about peak reading, about the role of listening, colonialism, as well as space and place. So I want to do a quick recap of some of those ideas and understand how they connect more broadly to our issues of listening. And we'll be building on these concepts for today and exploring this reading in a little bit more detail, some of the key observations, and just some information about the context and history of the location. So as we talked about, right, space is this more geographical, physical, bounded area. Space you can think more about as terms of the atoms, the structure, the overall elements. For instance, the Columbia River provides much of the physical border between Oregon and Washington, which constitutes more of space, whereas place is much more about the cultural significance, the connotation, and meaning that we attach to location. So if you're driving down I-5 and suddenly Oregon becomes California, right? That's not because there's like a geographical landmass separating them necessarily. It just means it's what we've determined to be the border between those areas. And that's been created to sort of reinforce the kind of cultural difference that we might have between the two states, including their driving habits. Another idea that we brought up was this idea of colonialism, right? Again, dealing with the idea that colonialism involves settlers who occupy land that, again, is already occupied or owned by individuals, including folks that might be indigenous to the area, establishing control and maintaining a certain level of expansion. We also talked about this idea of post-colonialism, that even if colonialism is not actively happening or going on, for instance, a country is able to gain its own sovereignty, right, that the impacts and effects of colonialism are still felt in terms of losing things like access to language, the ways that cultures might be shaped or impacted or affected, so on. Even things such as, right, the cuisine population can be impacted by colonialism, right? For instance, that's why things such as banh mi exist in sort of Vietnamese food, right? So colonialism and its impacts, including many of the negative impacts of sort of violence, control, of power, are important considerations for us to place in this week's reading and case study on Gibraltar. We also talked about this idea of a soundscape, the idea that similar to a landscape or physical surroundings through which meaning is established and created, a soundscape creates an opportunity for listening to occur in a broader sense. So soundscape provides that opportunity for listening. For this class, we'll be talking a little bit more about some of the ways that this peak reading specifically connects to listening and things that we talked about in the class and things to learn about the listening process. Talk about space, place, and listening a little bit more, and some of the cultural practices that happen in listening too. So I had you all last class report a little bit to me about Gibraltar and some of the things that you've learned. And I want to provide a little bit more context that I think will help, right? In readings like this week and last week and focused on Black-owned radio stations, right? What we're doing is having these sort of specific and focused case studies that more broadly can teach us a lot of different things about listening. So you might not know why Gibraltar matters or is that important, but there's a lot of takeaways and ideas that we get from this specific focus that more broadly used to understand listening. As we mentioned, right, this is a very small, about 2.6 square mile British territory. It's sort of based on that occupation and also is sort of dealing with this cultural clash, right, between British and Spanish sort of aspects of culture. It's about 32,000 people, and many of those folks will actually speak their own native language. So again, that sort of ties pretty closely to the cultural history and context. One of the things that's talked about in this week's article, right, is the idea that there's this like very large British parade that's loud, it's very nationalistic, and in many ways it's almost overriding or impacting the sound, the history, and the context that's occurring within that physical space. So I wanted to share a short video that provides a little bit more context and information about this area that helps us to understand and visualize some of the ways that listening is happening here.
The Iberian Peninsula is home to the lands of 5 countries, Andorra and France in the north, Portugal in the west, with Spain dominating the rest. Well, most of the rest, since country number 5, which sits in this tiny area in the south, is the United Kingdom. This territory is called Gibraltar, and despite numerous wars between the United Kingdom and Spain, Britain still holds the territory, which raises the obvious question: why? Why does Britain own Gibraltar? So the first part of this question is, how did Britain get a hold of Gibraltar in the first place? Well, the answer to that is simple. In the year 1700, the King of Spain died. Now, normally a king dying wouldn't be a problem, but this king, Charles II, didn't have any kids, which of course meant succession crisis. Charles chose Philippe of the House of Bourbon, and grandson of Louis XIV of France, to succeed him. This upset mostly everyone, since it placed Spain and its gargantuan empire firmly in the French sphere of influence, and so, of course, war. Everyone united against Spain and France, and in 1704, English and Dutch soldiers landed in Gibraltar and seized it to keep the mouth of the Mediterranean open. In 1713, in return for Britain leaving the war immediately, Spain opted to cede Gibraltar to them forever. Gibraltar's original population had largely fled during the war. It was stationed by British troops, and from then on acted as an important naval base whose population grew thereafter. So Britain now owned Gibraltar, but what stopped Spain from regaining it? It was a tiny stretch of land attached to the Spanish mainland, so surely it would have been simple to walk in and take it. Well, it turns out, no. It wasn't long until Spain and Britain were back at war again, and despite laying siege to Gibraltar a further 2 times over the next 75 years, it always held out. The largest siege came during the American War for Independence, when Britain's attention was focused on those rascals. Spain, with the help of the French, laid siege to Gibraltar for 4 years, hoping to starve the people out. However, the British were able to resupply Gibraltar due to the size of their navy and Spain's issues maintaining its own. As you'll know, Britain lost the war as a whole, and so when both sides sat down to negotiate, why didn't Spain use the opportunity to regain Gibraltar? One, Britain hadn't been conquered or crushed and could still fight, meaning Spain couldn't get everything it wanted. And two, it had more important land to regain, notably Florida and also Minorca, both of which it got. When all of that was over in 1783, Spain never made another military attempt to retake the rock. So that's it all settled then, right? Well, no. The Spanish government always maintained a claim to Gibraltar, much of which was down to its geographic positioning at the mouth of the Mediterranean, and also because its continued loss was seen as a blight on Spain's national honour. For the next century and a half, though, very little changed with respect to Gibraltar. That was until 1936, when the Spanish Civil War broke out. The border was closed, mostly because of there being too many refugees trying to flee Spain, and Britain further built up Gibraltar's defences. This caused disputes with Spanish leadership, since previously there had been an agreed neutral zone between the two areas. However, Spain wasn't looking, and so Britain quickly built up an airfield there, which became useful when World War II broke out. Now, Spain's new leader, Francisco Franco, was clear that he wanted Gibraltar back. However, when he was offered the chance to get it back by joining the Axis in World War II with Germany, he declined. Franco said no because the positives didn't outweigh the negatives, and also his country was in ruins. In the post-war world, there was a big drive towards decolonization, and Gibraltar was firmly in the crosshairs of this movement. A referendum was held in Gibraltar to determine whether the people wished to be a part of Spain or remain an overseas territory of the United Kingdom. And the results were extremely close, with over 99% of people opting to remain under the control of the United Kingdom. When Franco caught a mild case of death and his regime came to an end, relations between Britain and Spain improved, and after a series of negotiations, the border reopened. And despite the continuing dispute over the status of Gibraltar, there would be no further changes in its status, and to this day, it remains a British overseas territory.
So there's a lot, right, in regards to Gibraltar's history, its context, and its kind of disputing ownership. So I think the sort of takeaway here, right, is that this location, its proximity to Spain, again, it's like right down here in this tiny little strip, right, has sort of retained, including through referendum, this British overseas occupation and ownership, despite this Spanish effort to try to reclaim or continue to have this territory. So there's this very, this tension, this back and forth, but also the way that the region and its proximity to Spain has really drastically changed its elements of culture and identity as well. So I thought this would help to provide a little bit more information with regard to Gibraltar, its significance, and some of the cultural history and challenge that is seen there. So using, again, this case study and this focus of this week's reading, I want to highlight a few ways that this helps us to think about its importance to listening more broadly. One of the biggest ones, right, is this idea that, as we've talked about, colonialism is shaping a soundscape. That is, if a soundscape is referring to this combination, this cacophonous or harmonious sequence of sounds that together create a sort of location, that the soundscape is understood in the context of colonialism. That if we're looking, at this country, or we're looking at indigenous cultures in a variety of countries and groups, that colonialism is playing a big role in shaping how we understand the behaviors of those groups, right? If you've been following the news and following everything that's going on with Russia and Ukraine, right? This is very much at play as well in terms of issues of national sovereignty, ownership, and the roles for things such as colonial expansion or settling, right, or attempts at annexing play in that process too. The other idea here is that Gibraltar, again, is very tiny, 32,000 people. And as we've talked about, this idea of a rhetorical enclave or a specific population or group or situation is deeply connected to this as well, right? So within this enclave, within this location, there's an opportunity for cultural expression and participation. And also this idea that listening is occurring, again, in the context of space and place. So I think this helps us to think a little bit about what's been going on. I also want to go over a couple other terms that I think are useful as you're working through this reading. One of them being a Greek term known as a techne. Techne refers to a specialized skill or expertise So a techne of listening is a skill or knack that we can develop through listening. Aristotle and many of the other Greeks saw things such as rhetoric, persuasion, and aspects of communication as techne. They weren't necessarily an art, right? They weren't put them on a pedestal in that way, but they were a skill that allowed for expertise in it. Additionally, there's this idea of an ethnography, right? So ethnography or ethnographic approaches, if you've taken a class in ANSTO or another similar area, you might be familiar with this method. It involves going into a location and taking field notes or observations about that location, right? So rather than an interview where you're actively exchanging information and resources with others, and ethnography is more about you sort of observing and understanding what's going on, right? For instance, going into another country or culture, taking notes about that culture and its expressions of identity. Clifford Geertz, who is very prominent ethnographer, cultural theorist, right, was famous for an article in which he explored the country of Bali and its history of things like Balinese cockfighting and the way in which cockfighting was a representation and important element of Balinese culture and identity. It played such a huge part in that culture. And he got there through doing field notes, research, and study to try to understand what was going on. Again, useful things for us to understand because Peak, right, is doing ethnographic work, is taking field notes, is observing, is listening, and engaging in a soundscape. Similarly, if you do research for classes or projects, you might be thinking about how your own participation within that location, your own observation of a soundscape, what is going on, what's happening, what's listening is occurring, can also shape the process. I want to highlight a few key passages that I think really help to highlight Peak's argument here and some of the major things that we're learning through this process of engagement. So this idea here gets at the idea British nationals and expatriates, Spanish immigrants in Gibraltar, despite the coexistence of British loyalties and Spanish mannerisms among many Gibraltarians, this conflict is often manifested through cultural politics of language use. And one means of understanding the negotiation of cultural politics is through the study of listening. So let's unpack this a little bit, right? This idea, right, this conflict that we're seeing sort of between Spanish and British ownership and understanding of land is manifested. Conflict occurs through the way that we use language, and therefore the ways that we understand language through listening, right? If language refers to the ways that we use symbols to communicate and generate meaning, then listening refers to the way that we make sense of, understand, and provide feedback to those messages. That is, if language carries cultural weight and significance, including sort of British, Spanish, and native languages, and in order to understand and make sense of those languages, we're engaged in some level of conflict that deeply ties to issues of colonialism, culture, and identity. So listening provides a way by which we can understand how certain messages are received, why certain messages matter, and some of the tensions that occur when we're trying to gather and create this kind of piece. So I think that this really is an example that highlights much of the core of this argument. Another passage from this article that I think helps to highlight the core argument is that through socialization and cultural conditioning, right? Socialization refers to a process by which we become accustomed to or acclimated to the world, right? So Berger and Luckman, the social construction of reality, suggests that we experience primary and secondary socialization. Primary socialization being family, close relationships, and connections that we form early in life. Secondary socialization referring to being involved in school, in education, starting to participate in formal institutions in society. Cultural conditioning becomes the ways in which we become accustomed to or practice behavior in a particular culture. We start going out to eat at a restaurant and we know that we're supposed to tip because that's customary in the United States. So through that process of becoming acclimated to society, we learn what sounds are important, what sounds matter. For instance, if you're walking down the street and all of a sudden you hear a gunshot or you hear people yelling and screaming, right? You know that that's a sign that there's potential violence or problems going on. Or maybe you're used to, this sort of sounds of casual conversation, people talking, in the better times of year, if you've gone out to the farmer's market, right? Maybe you're paying attention to the sounds that are happening there. And you learn to locate out of the many simultaneous sounds that may be heard because they reflect or echo something that they believe themselves as people. I'll give you an example. If you are traveling internationally, right, if you're going to a foreign country in which you do not know the native language, and suddenly, as you're walking, you find people that are speaking your language. All of a sudden, right, you've located sounds that are important, that stand out to you, that represent you, right, and represent your own lived experience and what's important to you, right? So the ability to locate and identify sounds that are meaningful is important. Or to flip it around, right? If you're someone, or someone for whom English is not the first language and is coming here to study and to learn here in Oregon, you might find that the opportunity to hear someone who speaks a similar language or the same language to them is an opportunity to reflect on and feel that the culture is represented. Imagine what it would be like if all of a sudden, right, nobody spoke your language, and all of a sudden you were placed in this very different situation. That can be a major challenge for us to think about is how does the erasure of language impact the ability to listen, to understand, and to engage? And then the other passage that I wanted to highlight, and again, a really core finding here that emerges from this article is in regards to the parade. So in one of the sections of this article, it gets brought up that there is the sort of British parade that's happening in the middle of Gibraltar. This parade contains a dialectically connected MO, right? Dialectically refers to this idea of dialogue, of exchange between two people. It removes the space constructed by Spanish sounds, linguistic, musical, or otherwise, from the foreground of the landscape. That is, imagine, British nationals who are banging their drums, who, have their fancy outfits and hats, right? Who are all of a sudden occupying the space in the middle of downtown and marching. In so doing, this sound, this focus on this parade is overriding or overlapping the ongoing sounds and practices that are occurring in this space. It serves as a reminder to Gibraltarians of their status as British citizens who are reformed or impacted by the public space. That is, sound provides a means of confirmation that the presence of this parade is a reminder or reinforcement of a sort of British cultural identity that's placed onto that physical location. So I think that this, again, provides some additional context that helps us to understand what's going on here in regards to listening and making sense of space. I'll skip around a little bit, but I also wanted to show, there's a little video that is actually highlighting the physical setting of Gibraltar. So we'll know a little bit more about what we're talking about there.
Excuse me, sir. Can I just walk here? Thank you. Thank you.
So this is kind of around.
Wow, that's crazy.
Did not fall, which then Anglo-Dutch forces captured it during a war called the War of the Spanish Succession.
There's this kind of
And
cultural.
then it was legally handed to Great Britain as part of a treaty. And since then,
There's this bus
Part of my
riding
downtown
downtown.
here in Gibraltar, I was walking around the street and
Kind of the
finally I
downtown
encountered
area.
someone I like, two friends of my host, Benji. I just met them here.
It's not like any another part of Spain, and it's neither another part of UK. So as it's a mixture, the culture from here is very, as I said, it's mixed between the British and Spanish people. So you should come and see it, and you will find out.
If you can see.
You can even start to tell, if you were looking in the background of that video, of some of the like kinds of restaurants and places there, right? So there was the fish and chips, of course, very British, but also some of the more Spanish restaurants and cuisine. So as was kind of highlighted there, right, there's this very large emphasis on a mixture, a combination of these kind of competing sounds, competing cultural elements that are coming together to create this very different cultural experience. So to explore and to highlight some of this a little bit more, similar to last week, I'm going to break up into 3 groups. I'll have one on Zoom and then 2 face-to-face. And what I want each group to do is to focus on a section of this article. Again, this article has 3 primary sections that are focused on analyzing and making sense of the core ideas here. The first is this idea of soundscapes and as poetics, on page 176, poetics of linguistic acoustic ecologies on page 178, and parading toward a more complex linguistic ecology on page 182. And what I'll ask each group to discuss and then have somebody write or type for that group is, first of all, some of the key findings of this section of the article, what stands out, what's noted and noticeable here. How in this section does Gibraltar connect to listening? What's going on here in regards to the listening process? And then lastly, how do issues including language, identity, and colonialism shape listening too? So this will give you, a good amount of time to search, whether you have access to a device with the reading or you're just discussing and adding 2 points here in regards to this section. So I'll go ahead and create these groups here. So I will have the folks on Zoom as part of the first group, soundscapes and as poetics. Looks like we have, we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 on this side. Focus on poetics of linguistic acoustic ecologies, starting on page 178. And then we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 on this side. Focus on parading toward a more complex linguistic ecology, beginning on page 182. So take a good amount of time to look through, observe some of your findings from this section of the article. Have somebody who's ready to share some of those major observations that stand out to your group. So go ahead and create the breakout room as well. About 11:27. So I'll give folks about 15 minutes or so to work on this.
Exactly.
Culturally. Secondly, some more wearing self. Language, culture.
Yeah.
It's like the parade scenes down there. It's like a bulwark.
And then just like something which is so the things or they as a day goes when you Irish history the British official representation so
They kind of use like ground house as normal sounds of the large couch. Ambiance of it, or the normal soundscape was like.
was it the Islamic world they got that and imagery and anything on that it's just all right so it's linguistic that's portrayed in a more visual
Section of
But it is also. Spanish tourists.
yeah there's a section
was that's why.
More British nationals don't really listen to the.
and there's like a depth divide in like because they can travel to
Western.
British
Euro,
they listen to very ambiguous they feel like they're listening to something it's they try to yeah Spanish so I guess like yeah like how you listen to some this romantic is their romantic feel and
Why don't you kind
They're
of
trying to force. Really.
Give you about 5 or 6 more minutes.
I guess it'll go back to also so Spain, British, display or something that they say here. Visual display of English forms, oral display of British is British outfits. Really?
It's actually, it talks about there's actually a constant cultural shift. But so subtle that it says something the other ones aren't really aware of, but it should towards more Western culture, like the domination of English, despite like, the kind of the rift between them and the tourists, a lot of it's associated with race with a sense of pride. Yeah, there's kind of a subtle culture shift that's happening. It sounds like it's starting to.
Take about 2, 3 more minutes. I'll close the breakout room here in just a second. Little bit of time to finish up and make sure you have somebody in your group that's ready, available to share. All right, so let's take some time to talk about these different sections. I'll ask each group to share their answers to these 3 questions, and I think this will help in understanding some of the key findings from this article better, and also to connect it to this process of listening. So let's start by hearing from the folks that were on Zoom. So what did you 2 find in addressing these questions? Among the Zoom pair, is there one of you that would prefer to share?
I guess I'll take it. See, I'll take for the team because since I was having to do a lot of Grammarly, so here we go. So the first question is mostly about the power of soundscapes, not exactly using the sound, what's around them, but mostly about their culture, how they interpret their own ways of what they listen to. And the second one is basically how the soundscape of language, what they use and how they identify the things, what's around them, and how culture is being used to interpret the powers of soundscapes, not exactly what they see, but how their culture interprets their own thing. But number 3, we really did not, we still had time to work on that one still. Could not find it.
So thanks for getting a good start here. In terms of thinking about these first couple questions, right? I think some of the key findings and ideas, as you all brought up, is that the sort of soundscape is creating this sort of sense of cultural identity, the sort of hustle and bustle of the streets, the opportunity for people to engage and connect toward one another. You did a good job of connecting this more broadly to this little territory. In terms of language, identity, and colonialism, and some of the ways that they can shape listening. Right, obviously the history and the context that we talked about a little bit more earlier today and on Wednesday is helpful, right? Understanding that the sort of competing ownership and occupation between British and Spanish settlers plays a really big role here. The idea that there's this small population that has its own language and that language is oftentimes maybe at odds with the sort of British parades and role of language there. Can definitely shape listening there too. So I think thinking about it in terms of Gibraltar's history in relationship to British culture, I think is useful there. Let's hear from the second group here on poetics of linguistic acoustic ecologists.
Yeah, so we said, for one, the people of Gibraltar are in a spot that looks like Spain. The town looks like the UK. It sounds like a mix of Spanglish. The diversity is mixed, poetic representation of their cultures. Linguistic is visually, as in this quote, the juxtaposition might be understood as a linguistic acoustic ecology suggests an inner relationship of organisms and within their environment. I use this as a metaphor of ecology to argue that multiple linguistic sounds come to represent a particular image of Gibraltar and the shape of a particular experience of space. Number 2, we said staying organized on one language because tourists would rather listen to a cleaner English than broken Spanish. And 3, if someone considers themselves English, that means they fell to colonialism because they might not be from the UK. They still feel that is their identity. It's the same with America. And people in America during the revolution who still identify as British.
Yeah. Awesome work, Trevor. I think your group did a great job of highlighting some of the important ways that language shapes that listening process. In fact, for many folks who are bilingual, multilingual, or come from families in which the language that they primarily speak might be different than them and other family members, oftentimes folks find themselves in this awkward kind of space where they might need to learn a new language as a practice of acclimating or adjusting to that society or culture, and at the same time might feel like they're betraying their culture, right, by learning that language. So that can be this really complex and challenging situation that folks are navigating. Again, developing this new language that sort of serves as a mixture of the two and at the same time feeling this pull between either side in regards to expressing, sharing, and participating in language as well. Lastly, let's hear from this third group on this side.
So some of the key findings that come in this article are, there's a native and cultural difference that is happening in Gibraltar. And the British use drums to redominate the sounds that are in Gibraltar. And then in this section, Gibraltar, it doesn't really connect with this one because of the divide that is between the different nations. And then the language, identity, and colonialism that's shaped in this section are, there's a cultural shift that is happening in Gibraltar with like the British using it as a political tool and as a staff power.
Yeah. So really good observations here with regard to this parade and the way that this parade is shaping or perhaps overlapping sounds. Also in terms of creating divides, including cultural divides, physical divides, language divides, and so on. Right? As we're thinking about the role of language and the role of listening, that when we are creating divides on the boundaries of language, colonialism, identity, and so forth, right, that those divides can make it more difficult for us to connect across cultures, to understand one another, and then to engage with the history and context that's associated with listening, right? So we might think about the ways that we speak and the ways that we engage as participating in or supporting many of those kinds of divides too. So I think taken together, these sections help us to sort of map out and better understand the cultural and linguistic and listening landscape that's happening. To wrap up for today and to this week's topic, right, on space and places connection to listening, we've talked about how space and place impact the construction of listening, the creation of a soundscape, the combination of sound and the meaning that we attach toward particular places as well. What we choose to listen to, right, and how we emphasize listening and approaches is impacted by things like culture and power, as we've talked about, that divides the ability to practice language or the ability to create a listenable message. And also the idea that listening occurs in the context of our shared understanding, that we need to have to bridge those divides and understand what it means for sound or visual or other types of cues to occur in a given place. So what we'll be getting into next week is this idea and question of what makes listening accessible, right? Noting that listening is a sensory experience. What does it mean when listening is reached across populations for whom sensory accessibility is not happening in the same ways? So we'll be talking about accessibility, disability, difference, and the ways that we can create listenable and accessible messages. Please pass forward or email your group's work for today. Have a great rest of your day, a good weekend, and I'll catch up with you all again next week.